Today is the day of elimination in the Skilling Open, my friends. It's the second day of the semi-final between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi, as well as Hikaru Nakamura and WESLEY. So, WESLEY and Magnus have a 1-0 lead, so Hikaru and Nepo have to fight back. Let's see what happened in the games. Magnus and Nepo, we will go through that match first, and then we will go into Hikaru and WESLEY. So, alright, Nepo begins with e4, and these two guys have actually been playing the Spanish. They've been playing a lot of bishop b5, Rue Lopez. In this particular way, Magnus plays a6, which is the main line, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, d3. Someone asked in the comments of the last video, I do read the comments, so leave a comment if you don't usually, what does theory mean? That's a good question if you don't know, like, the true extent of it. Theory is all recorded games. Games at the highest of levels, lowest of levels, in a massive database. These guys even look at computer games. So all of this has been seen many, many times. But Magnus plays something a little bit non-standard. He plays like rook e8, bishop f8, and he tries to kick out Nepo's bishop, take in the center, and a very important move, g6. So you notice that Magnus played bishop e7, then put the rook, then put the bishop back. So now the rook is out, and then he's going to put his bishop here. So Magnus likes to mess around in traditional Spanish openings with the black pieces. He does this a lot, kind of turning the game into a King's Indian, sort of King's Indian defense. The first big trade happens here, bishop f3, gf3. So Nepo damages his structure because had he taken with the queen, you have to think the queen, what did it use to protect? It used to protect the d-pawn. Very important thing to just remember before you move any piece. You won't be able to move the queen because this will be hanging. So you damage the structure, and knight takes d4, that used to block the rook's path down to c7, which is exactly why this happens. Magnus plays rook a7, very interesting coordination here of his pieces. They all guard each other. And Nepo wins a pawn. Not really, he wins it for the b2 pawn, but this pawn is felt more, if that makes sense. This b2 pawn is not really felt. The d6 pawn is felt, because once the queen arrives, it now has pressure there, and there, and there, and down this way. And this bishop is a killer. It's got a very annoying kind of pull. And now Nepo begins a process to move his knight to the e4 square. That is not the e4 square, to the e4 square. He wants to move his pawn forward. The problem is that right now black controls that square with 3 different pieces. But he controls them with knight, rook, and bishop. What's worth less than all 3 of those? A pawn. So he pushes the pawn to then push this pawn to then put his knight here. That's his plan. But Magnus begins fighting back. Nepo plays bishop d5, gluing it all together. We get bishop d4. All of a sudden, it's actually not so clear who is attacking who. Rook e2, knight d3, king g2. Seemingly walking into, not quite, that is protected, but walking into this in the future, king g7, rook d2, and bishop c5, but queen c6. Nepo set a trap. Now the rook is hanging, and this is hanging. And there's a problem here. It looks like you can actually not defend both. And in the game, after taking on f4 with a check, Nepo very bravely walked forward with the king rather than going back. Now the knight is hanging, and so is the rook. Now, in this position, Magnus could have played something which I want all of you to kind of learn this concept. I say this a lot, danger levels. So you don't need to move your rook. If you can create equal or exceeding danger, you would do that by playing the move bishop to b4, because that would be equal danger, right? Now, if I move my rook, let's say to c2, you have a move here, now that your bishop is no longer hanging, to defend both pieces. See, the difference in this position, if you try to defend both of these pieces, is the other thing. What did that use to protect? Your queen used to protect the bishop, so by moving it to guard the other pieces, right, you forgot the bishop on c5. So what did I use to protect? And equal or exceeding danger, right? And in the game, well, he lost the knight. Now, it's still equal, actually. It's still equal, but it got very chaotic. Magnus here had less than a minute, played bishop f2. Nepo plays king g4, avoiding the bishop check on e3, rook f6, and after h5 check, just hides his king on h3. So his king goes out for a little midlife crisis journey, then he breaks through. So he realizes that actually it's Magnus's king, who is very weak. And a few moves later, after this nice sacrifice to open up the g-file, look at that. Look at that. The sacrifice of the knight to open up the g-file, rook g6, king e5, and the very calm bishop to b3. Magnus in this game won King of the Hill, which is a variant of chess where you win by putting your king in the 4 central squares of the board. But Nepo wins this game by virtue of checkmate. Magnus resigns because this is mate on the next move. How rare is it that the world champion gets checkmated with the king in the center of the board? You know it's big when Mr. Agadmatar makes a YouTube video of the game 5 minutes after it concludes. You know this is very, very significant. So in the second game, now Magnus is down 1-0. He needs to fight back. So he begins with e4, c5, and c3. This is called the Alpine Sicilian, and the point is to put a pawn in the center, d4. I actually do very much recommend this if you're an intermediate player and you want like a weapon against Sicilian that's not too crazy. But Nepo plays knight f6, which is one of the main lines. And now rather than playing d4, Magnus plays knight f3 and delays the move d4, actually, like, completely. He en passants Nepo here, and then just castles. So Magnus literally never plays the move d4, he just plays a4. The point of this is to just get a person in the Sicilian defense out of mainline theory. Now, Nepo is a Sicilian player. He, of course, has played the Sicilian, but he might have never been expecting a position like this. So Magnus just pushes his a-pawn all the way to the end. Why not? Plays d4. They trade in the center. And actually, the first move out of theory, Nepo already makes a small mistake. He plays b5 here. The move b5, which grants his knight kind of backwards access. He can also play queen c4, offering a trade. Apparently, this was not the move according to theory. And then Nepo played an even stranger move here. He played the f6. He realized that if he castles, his rook no longer protects the pawn. So he's going to play f6 and hide his king on f7. And what does Magnus do? He plays rook b3, attacks b5, and rook b4. Little Tetris play here to try to bring the rook over here. And that's exactly what he does. Even at the cost of the a6 pawn, he understands he will win this pawn back. Nepo doesn't trade. But now h4. Very important move. Now, this pawn on the h-file will no longer ever be a target. And he's just gaining space. In the future, maybe he wants to play h5, h6. Let's see if it happens. Well, I told you h5 was going to happen. I told you h6 was going to happen. Only Magnus Carlsen would so cold-bloodedly just push both. He pushed both his a-pawns, his a and h pawns, all the way down the board. We get take, queen h5, and Magnus takes the pawn on h6, pinning his bishop to his own queen, seemingly unable to move completely, but realizing that after something like this, also one important thing I just want to point out here, in this position, if rook takes h6, the queen has to protect. So if you take the queen, I take your queen. If you take the rook, I take you. But there's this. Queen takes g6. I sack the queen because I'm going to win your queen back, and we get this kind of a position. Nepo plays queen c6, queen knight rook, versus queen bishop rook and 4 pawns each. And a position that seems very difficult to navigate. This move f5 was a mistake by Nepo. It was a mistake because now he has a bunch of pieces on light squares, and you're fighting against the dark squared bishop. That means the bishop can maneuver in and out of your position very easily, and that's exactly what he does. Magnus is able to trade off the rook to create an outside pass pawn, giving himself some good practical chances. He plays h4. He has a new h-pawn that he can push. Queen e8, and now we see how quickly it all falls apart for Nepo. It looked like, I mean, even if you go here with the engine, it says 0, 0, 0. It says it's completely equal. But how quickly it all falls apart because Magnus is able to fight only on the dark squares. Look at this. Every single piece he has is on a dark square. And then the queen is then able to infiltrate on the light squares. It's kind of cool how he dominates, kind of one color complex. And then he's able to, just as his opponent blunders, continue to pick away kind of on the other side of the board. It would have been better here for Nepo to play king f7. Very brave move, stopping queen e8. If queen e7, king here. This looks like you're about to mate the guy because of this and this, but check, and you're just surviving it enough. So, Nepo goes 2 pawns down, tries to create some counterplay, but Magnus very easily starts now pushing his queenside pawns, all the while making sure his king is completely defended, and he's okay. And right here, h5, Nepo resigned after knight h5. There would have been this move. Magnus strikes back. Okay, time for game number 3. Game 3 was more of the same. It was a roui. This time Magnus actually goes for something much more classical with knight a5 and c5. This is a much more standard main line. Nepo tries to plop a knight into f5, and we get d5. So Magnus wins connect 4 after winning king of the hill. Nepo now plays bishop g5. A lot of weird stuff here going on in the center, a lot of tension between the pawns. So Nepo tries to cut through it and play queen h3. Now he begins an extraction process of this bishop. So watch. Bishop b1. Bishop takes. Knight e4. And he was one move away. Actually here, you know, it's kind of funny. Like if you play c3, you finally do get the bishop out. But then Magnus would play f6. And this is sort of the problem. You have to choose between either advancing into the position or not. Nepo threatens a mate. Nepo plays queen e3. He's now one move away from checkmate. Queen h6 and queen g7 would be mate. So Magnus sacrifices the rook for a knight and a pawn. Nepo plays a cool move on the queen side, trying to get Magnus to do this, which would result in a new target. But Magnus just plays b4, keeping his pawns together. A queen trade now. And this is actually completely okay for black because of how active his pieces are. Like, does this even count as a bishop? I don't know. Well, the players continue to try to simplify here, and we get a repetition of moves. We get a repetition because, frankly, there's nothing else that white can really do. White is a move away from losing the c3 pawn, then the bishop will come back to d4, and you'll lose f2, then you lose g2, you lose h2, you lose every single pawn that you have. And of course, Magnus goes for rook d1 because Nepo will not take. You just shuffle the pieces. Magnus is okay with the match being tied. So now it's game 4. Nepo has to win. If he ties this rapid match today, he loses overall because Magnus won yesterday. This time Nepo has the black pieces. What is Nepo going to go for? Nepo goes for Sicilian, of course. This time Magnus goes for the Moscow variation with bishop b5 check, knight d7 and a4. A move which to the untrained eye looks completely stupid, frankly. This move looks like it accomplishes nothing. But the point is that after a6, you don't always have to take. And you know that black will want to push this pawn to b5 in the future, so you stop that with a4. It's just one of the ways of playing, and you see exactly now Magnus doesn't want b5. So Nepo has to play this position for a win. The problem is that now Magnus gets to play queen d4, since the knight is no longer moving to c6, the knight is on d7. Now he gets very easy development, puts his rook on the open file with the queen, develops his bishop, doesn't want his bishop to get taken, so he moves it out of the way. And Nepo here kind of tries to double up and be solid, be dynamic with a messy pawn structure and maybe getting the bishop out and maybe castling because he's got to play for a win. But Magnus is very practical. If you know your opponent has to beat you, what are you going to do? You're going to trade all his pieces, obviously. Now here there was something beautiful I just want to show you that could have happened. It didn't happen. But if Nepo had played rook c8 here, reinforcing, this exact position is why you always look for checks. Here, white has mate in 3. Queen takes e6, f e6, and bishop h5. Look at that. How insane is that? In the middle of a game, you can just get mated like this. Sacrifice the queen, and just the two diagonal killers. If on the first move you play here, it's still mate, that's an even faster mate. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Of course, didn't happen because we're talking about GMs. But these are the kinds of moments you miss in your games, right? Like, you play a game, you go analyze, it says big blunder. You're like, how did I blunder? Oh my god, I missed check and check on the other diagonal. So, I figured I would share that with you, but instead of that, we just got Magnus trading the queens and being extremely solid. He sacrifices a pawn on the queen side to get a completely open position. He also has the 2 bishops. Nepo, despite having 5 pawns versus 4, it doesn't really feel like he has any extra pawns. And that was it. They simplified pieces. Nepo tried to create something, but things got traded. Rooks got traded, and on move 35, Nepo offered a draw. Magnus accepted it, and Magnus is the first finalist in the Skilling Open. Magnus Carlsen has been unstoppable in 2020. He has lost matches and games here and there. He had a crazy match against Hikaru earlier, a few months back, in the Magnus Carlsen Chess Tour Finals, but oh my goodness, this man just cannot lose. Let's see who plays him in the final. Yesterday, Hikaru lost to WESLEY. He had a few good moments in the first game, but overall, WESLEY's play has been unbelievable. So we go to the first game. WESLEY begins, we get a Spanish, and Hikaru also goes for one of these kind of King's Indian style Spanishes. Now, the position that happens here, notice how WESLEY doesn't play very classically, knight c3, d3. If your opponent gives you an opportunity to build for the center with c3 and d4, you should try it in e4, e5 position. c3, d4 is a very cool way to put 2 pawns in the center. Of course, Hikaru knows what he's doing, and he's no slouch, and he gets a completely normal looking position himself. Now here, this is a nice little positional exercise. There is a square. First of all, you would start like this. Which one of my pieces is the worst? Well, this guy. I mean, this guy's not very active. You look around the board. Where would you like this knight to exist where it cannot be targeted by your opponent's pieces? Oh, that would be kind of nice. So knight b3 and, well, knight c5. Of course. So queen d6 and Wesley damages the structure. Wesley then plays rook e4 with the idea to maybe go here, and as we will see in a moment, with the idea to create the same side pawn push. That's one thing we notice in a lot of these games. These guys know when they can push the pawns in front of their kings to attack the other player. And that's exactly what Wesley does. He trades off and plays h5, sacrificing a pawn for this super open line. Now, one more thing. You see how the bishops are in opposite colors? That benefits the player who is attacking. Because if you're attacking your opponent on the light squares, like with this bishop, the opponent's dark squared bishop plays no role in defense, right? So that will be in Wesley's benefit. And that's exactly what happens throughout the rest of this game. Wesley puts Hikaru in a, I mean, just super constricted here for the cost of a few pawns over there. Wesley then makes the game simplified into this endgame, which, if you look at the count of pieces, Hikaru's up a pawn. The biggest problem here is this. How on earth do you deal with this? You cannot get rid of this pawn. And the problem is that as Wesley flies around the board, you see what Wesley's going to do. He has free reign. He can just walk around the board and take all the pawns. Hikaru can never go down and take a pawn for himself, because what will happen is that it's not just about promoting safely. If you promote here, you're going to lose this. But the point is this. The queen cannot abandon the defense of the king. The pawn can be sacrificed. That's called a clearance sacrifice for the square. You can just get something to f7 and you will be safe. And there you go. So since that cannot happen, Hikaru's just left to shuffling his pieces around while Wesley picks up the pawns. And then Hikaru came up with an idea. What if I open Wesley's king? Watch what Hikaru does. He sacrifices the pawns. He sacrifices the pawns on the other side of the board to open up Wesley's king. He does that so that he has a chance of a perpetual check. He's now down 3 pawns. But because Wesley has an open king, there is still hope for a perpetual check, which is a little net that the king cannot escape from, resulting in a draw. So in a totally lost endgame, open up your opponent's king. That's exactly what he does. In this position, if Wesley just pushes the pawn and Hikaru gives a check, you cannot take the bishop because, of course, this. Hikaru here can play something like this. Wesley can run his king to like the center, for example, and he can just be completely safe. There is a little sequence of checks, which results in you completely covering up your king, and you're winning because of the pass pawn. In the game, Wesley went for a queen trade and blundered perpetual check after queen g4. This is just a draw, because after queen d1, you cannot block, you lose your bishop. A stunning blunder from Wesley in a +10 position, giving Hikaru a breath of life. Because had he lost this game, he would have needed 2.5 points out of the next 3 to beat Wesley. Let's see what happened in the second game. This time Hikaru has white himself, and he goes back to the scholar's mate attack. And by that I mean the bishop's opening, as he did yesterday. And now they go into a Vienna, one of my favorite openings. Hikaru gives away the bishop on c4 in order to develop his queen and bishop, but Wesley doesn't take, instead choosing to fight for the center with c6, but then not playing d5, he goes for d6. This is the benefit of not putting the knight on f3 and keeping it on e2 in these kinds of positions. You get to play the move f4. Then you get the open f file for your pieces, and we got a position like this. This is kind of perfect if you're trying to play for the win with white. Why? Imbalance. Black has a weak pawn on d5, you've got the open file, you have 2 knights and a bishop, they have 2 bishops and a knight, so the tactics of the pieces are going to be a little bit different. Now let's see what Hikaru does. He reroutes his knight backward and forward, and consolidates his position like this. Now he's got the open f file, and the way he's going to break through here is he's going to bring his bishop, he's going to stack his rooks, and he's going to play g4. That is the key. He needs to get this knight out of here. But Wesley is no joke. He takes on f4 and plants his rook in the center. How many of us would play stuff like this, or even stuff like this? If I can just back up for a moment, I kind of like went a little bit fast through these two moves. b5 and rook a6 were played because he knows the rook in the future will take part in the game on the 6th rank if this knight ever moves, and b5 was played because in the future he will play b4 and create counterplay on the c-pawn. The foresight of these guys playing on the queen side, the center, the king side, seeing how all of it interacts. Incredible. Hikaru, meanwhile, continues to chug away at the king side. Now Wesley plays a beautiful move. h4. What did that use to guard? g4. Queen c8. Beautiful move from Wesley targeting this pawn. Rook g2, and now Wesley says, you're not going to play g5, I'm going to play g5. Take, rook takes, and immediately Hikaru makes a mistake, knight h5. Hikaru was hoping for something like this, which would have resulted in a opening of the position, but Wesley can also take on g4, and suddenly Hikaru is scrambling backwards as the rooks turn the tables on his position. Then b4. Remember I told you a long time ago b4 was going to happen? cb4, and Wesley is coming in with his pieces. All of a sudden, all the pieces are here. They repeat once here, so Wesley gains some time. But after king h1, Wesley takes and takes. In this position, the evaluation after queen takes d4 is plus 11 for Wesley. That means that you could give Hikaru any combination of a queen and two pawns, 2 rooks and 1 pawn, a rook, a bishop, a knight, a rook and 2 knights, plus 11. It is completely lost, not just because of the material, but because of the weakness of the king. And then, as Wesley's time went lower, he picked up a second pawn, but that was the wrong pawn. And then right here, Wesley disregarded the attack on his rook to counterattack Hikaru's queen. But what he blundered was that after this, rook g6, he probably thought that the knight is untouchable because of checkmate. And he's right. But he might have blundered that after this, there is queen f2. Disregarding the attack on the rook, danger level on the queen, and if something like this happens, white is doing okay. There is a fork of the rooks, but rook takes f7, gets you out of danger, and wins a pawn with check. So Wesley, in a time trouble, blunders into a ridiculous endgame and has to sacrifice the knight for 3 pawns. It looks like you're about to get mated. Actually, in a lot of these positions, you are just about to move away from getting mated, but this is a draw because there is check, check, and if the king tries to run away here, there is check. The b pawn, this b pawn, holds it all together. The king cannot go over here. If this pawn was back on b6, the king would run around its pawn and get away, but that pawn holds the glue, and this would just be a draw. And that's what happened in this game. They shuffled around for about 15-20 moves. Hikaru trying to trap Wesley somehow, and it wasn't able to happen. Another draw. Now, in the third game, well, actually, you guys are going to laugh at this, but they played a Nimso Indian defense, a variation of it, that they've already played a forced draw in twice. They played 27 moves of theory. I'm not even going to go move by move. This is 27 moves of theory. Look, there's pawns flying all over the board. This, according to best play, pieces flying all over the board, simplification, pieces getting traded, and then a repetition of moves and a draw. Now, you would say, why would they waste the game like that if Hikaru has to win? Well, Hikaru told us afterward he wasn't feeling good about the first 2 games, so he wanted to stabilize, and he felt like his best chance was to win with white. I mean, that is just a match strategy. You stabilize, you stop the bleeding, you take a break, and now it's on to the 4th game. Let's see if Hikaru is able to complete the comeback versus Wesley So. He begins with knight f3. Now, at this point, Anish Giri actually joined me and Anna on the broadcast to do a little bit of commentary on the games. Hikaru begins with a reverse King's Indian attack in this case, because this opening keeps a lot of pieces on the board and allows for a lot of flexibility. Notice how Wesley plays. He copies the fianchetto, he puts 2 pawns in the center, and now we get c4. And what's kind of funny about the position that they got from the opening is that this is following a game that Anish played against Magnus Carlsen, and Anish actually pointed that out, and even Hikaru pointed that out afterward and told us he knew Anish was there, so he knew he had to pay homage to Anish and play the way Anish played with Magnus. Now, in this particular game, the first kind of exchange between the players came on move 17, the opening of the queen side, and you see that Hikaru is trying to make some progress here. WESLEY takes, and plays f5, clearing out the f5 square. Hikaru now responds with danger levels, not moving his bishop out of the way. You have c5, counter-attacking the knight, and WESLEY plays queen c8. Now we get knight a4. This is a really cool move, trying to go knight b6. If you take knight b6, and the queen cannot stay guarding the knight on e6. However, there is the interposing defense. If you missed yesterday's recap, I told you guys about interposing. You can put a piece in the way of an attacking piece, knight d5. Hikaru takes, and we get this position. A super tense position here in the center of the board. Rook d1 going for the pawn. WESLEY does not go back and defend it to be passive. He begins counterattacking operations on f3, on h3, and the computer here wanted Hikaru to play king g2, walking directly into this. So sidestep, d4 would be allowed, and of course you cannot play that because the king is there. So you would sidestep and go for this. Not a very human-like thing. Hikaru instead says, let's go, WESLEY. I'm attacking your knight. WESLEY plays knight to the center. Hikaru plays b5, hitting the queen. You cannot take on c5 because here there is knight takes d5, and you think, okay, so what? I get out of the way. Well, this queen, forcing moves in chess. Are there any checks? Are there any captures? And what's the most powerful thing that I can attack? There's no checks. Is there even a capture here for white? There isn't. But that's the most powerful thing you can attack, and you would win material by virtue of what's called an X-ray or a skewer. So, since that is impossible, WESLEY goes queen e6, and after this trade, he goes rook d8. He doesn't take the free pawn. He notices the coordination here of Hikaru's pieces, and he plays rook d8. Now here, Hikaru disregards the knight hanging and plays c6 because after rook d5, he thought that he had the following continuation, cb7. The problem is that black can get back in time to stop the promotion. Rook d8, rook a1, trying to go here, but black has knight c5 or knight d6, and if you play here, knight takes b7. The pawn is grabbed, the rook is protected, and the game is lost. So Hikaru goes rook a7, defending his pawn, hoping for bishop to a3. The problem here is that black can take anyway and play rook d1 check. And somehow white is always a move not in time. WESLEY defends very well. And a few moves later, they repeat moves. WESLEY, again, repeating in a position where he's better to clinch the match. And WESLEY moves on, winning in the rapid portion against Hikaru to play Magnus Carlsen in the final. This is a rematch in many ways of another world championship. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but Wesley So is a world champion in Fischer Random, or Chess 960, which is the starting position of chess being shuffled with 960 possible iterations. That's called Fischer Random Chess 960. You guys can check it out. And Wesley actually defeated Magnus. The point of that type of chess is there's no opening preparation. It's actually kind of unique and interesting. So we will see what happens tomorrow. What's kind of a tragedy is that Wesley, according to the live ratings, none of these tournaments are FIDE rated because they're online. Wesley's the 21st ranked rapid player in the world, but he is not playing like the 21st ranked rapid player in the world. He's easily top 5. He's top 5 in the world in Blitz. He's definitely top 5 strength in the world, top 10 guaranteed. In Classical, exceptionally strong player, and he's played beautiful chess, as you can see from his games today. So the finals begins tomorrow. Now you know. What do you think is going to happen? Who is going to win? By what margin? There are 2 days of rapid chess and maybe some Blitz and maybe some Armageddon if it gets there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you for the finals recap.